Deputy Speaker, I beg to move that this House do now adjourn.
The question is that this House do now adjourn. Mrs. Margaret Thatcher.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, whatever view the Prime Minister may take about the situation in Britain, the opposition took the view that we were in a position of grave trouble of crisis proportions. And I should have thought that that was no longer in doubt, and it was of such a nature and such a proportion that it would also be of great concern to the House, and that we should debate it at the earliest opportunity. The Prime Minister took a different view, and after a month's recess was not prepared to provide a day from government time, so we provided a supply day of our own. Inquiries around the several organisations about the precise position have revealed a very grim picture indeed. The transport reports, the Freight Transport Association, which represents own-account operators like supermarkets, officially they're not in dispute according to the agreement with the TGWU, and they should be exempt from picketing. They report that own-account vehicles are being widely picketed. They also report that basic food supplies are being stopped. The Road Haulage Association confirms that picketing is affecting the supplies of essential goods. The Freight Transport Association also reports a new problem, shortage of diesel fuel, particularly in the southwest because of picketing at the oil terminals at Avonmouth. British Rail report quite simply there are no trains today. And British Transport Docks, the nationalised ports sector, say that on average traffic at their ports is down 40%. Practically no containers are getting in and out of Southampton, though the rail strike has added to the burden. The report from CBI, many firms are being strangled, there's a shortage of materials, they can't move their own products, exports are being lost. They say that secondary picketing of firms not in dispute, is very heavy all over the country. There's particularly of things like salt, packaging, sugar, and all vital materials necessary if industry is to keep going. Layoffs known to CBI, at least 125,000 already, expected to be 1 million by the end of the week. There are telegrams and telexes in from many companies saying that their exports are not being allowed through and that they might lose the orders forever. And messages from firms like Marks and Spencer's. Last week they lost 20% of their food production, approximately £2 million. Unless secondary pickets are removed this week, we estimate 30% off production. In the last week and this week, unless there's a change, we shall not shift 50% of our exports. The food industry in particular is shambolic. There is pressure on edible oils, on yeast, on salt, on sugar, on packaging. No maize came through Tilbury yesterday. Associated Biscuits have already laid off 1,500 in Huyton, 400 in Southampton, and more by the weekend. Cold stores are laying off people, and all large oil mills in Hull were picketed yesterday, except the one visited by BBC television. Mounting chaos, if that isn't mounting chaos, it is difficult to see what is. The strikes we're experiencing today are not the only ones we've had recently. The tanker drivers, thank goodness, is over. We had the bread strike, we've had hospital strikes, we've had strikes at old people's homes, strikes in newspapers, in broadcasting, in airports, and car strikes. Many people who thought previously that strikes were a characteristic of large firms only, and that most firms were strike-free, received a rather rude shock from a new piece of work by the Social Science Research Council, a government-financed body, which finds that nearly half our factories had some form of industrial conflict, stoppages, overtime bans, go slow, in the past 2 years, and nearly 1/3 suffered from all-out strikes. This is the picture in Britain today. And the troubles will not be over when the immediate strikes are settled. So there are not only more problems in the pipeline, but many of the problems arising from the present strike will carry on for a very much longer time than the strikes themselves. Many export orders might never be regained, and companies and firms which have struggled hard to get them may have to lay off their workers. Some of the small firms upon which Britain depends so much may be forced into bankruptcy, and they too will have to lay off their workers. It was interesting this morning on BBC, a typical road haulage man who said, yes, he knew what he could afford. He could only survive about another 4 days because he was already losing £1,000 a day. Now, what is our approach to this grievous strike situation? Unlike the Prime Minister, we do not go round supporting strikes when we're in opposition. We never have and we never shall. These things are a weapon of the present government party, and the nation is reaping a bitter harvest from that attitude and approach which they have taken. The Prime Minister will not like it, but it is pertinent that he be reminded exactly what attitude he took during phase 3 of the miners' strike. An offer approximately the same as that which the road haulage people are offering now. When the miners were being offered 16%, he said this to my predecessor: unless he has more money to put on the table, he has a bigger struggle on his hands than he has ever imagined. Mr. Heath is arguing that he is fighting inflation. Mr. Callaghan continued, that is utter drivel. The Prime Minister obviously expects the opposition not to follow his example, and indeed we shall not do so. We shall act responsibly, and he is very fortunate that we shall do. So no one on this side will be urging the road hauliers to pay more. No one will be quoting the minimum amounts that they are paid. We are much more likely, I think, to believe the comments that we've heard on radio and television of many lorry drivers saying that their regular pay varies from £75 to £100 a week. Now, the Prime Minister's answer to all our troubles is a statistic, X%, this year to be 5%. But we cannot have rigid pay policies forever. That is not a possible way of conducting affairs in a free country, in a country which has a great deal much varied industry, in a country which must have its industry changing, always keeping abreast of the times, steadily one step ahead of competitors if we are to survive. It is not a possible way. What is more, it's not even possible on the way the government proposes to carry out its present policies. There is no way in which it will work. And I thought that the Lord President on television admitted that last Sunday when he had a very long interview. He pointed out that the low-paid workers were going to get far more than 5%. That had already been arranged. We know from legislation which the government has passed, Schedule 11 of the Employment Protection Act, that the workers just above the low paid can use that particular section to break through any incomes policy and to get higher pay because other people in the area are getting higher pay. The Prime Minister introduced that schedule. He introduced that legislation. It was part of the price he paid to the unions for the earlier stages of incomes policy. And he knows and we know that unless he has proper provision for differentials, for people who take the trouble to acquire extra skill and the years it takes, industry cannot be kept going because we shall not have the skilled labour we need. So his policy cannot and will not work. He said earlier this afternoon, when tackling the problem of inflation, yes, of course, he believed in money supply. That, I believe, is now common ground between us. He, in fact, over the period of his government and that of his immediate predecessor, 5 years of Labour government, has debased the coinage to a greater extent than any other government.